Welcome back to Fossil versus Future. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And today we're going to talk about...
war.
What about war? The relationship between climate change and conflict is complex and interconnected. The link between climate change and security goes both ways. Climate change fuels conflict by acting as a crisis multiplier. It forces people to migrate, heightens competition for scarce resources, and intensifies existing social, economic, and political tensions. The physical impacts of climate change, land degradation, resource scarcity, and extreme weather events, exacerbate existing vulnerabilities, inequality, exclusion, and injustice. At the same time, conflict hinders efforts to combat climate change. It erodes trust between nations, making global cooperation on climate policy more difficult, and diverts political attention and resources away from urgent climate action. For example, the UK has recently pledged to spend 2.5% of its GDP on defence by 2027, while simultaneously reducing aid spending to its lowest level since 1999. In the last financial year, the UK spent £53.9 billion on defence. Climate action must not become a casualty of increasing military budgets. Moreover, the global military sector itself is a major contributor to climate change, responsible for around 5.5% of global emissions, more than the entire continent of Africa. Addressing climate change and preserving peace are inseparable goals. Without stability, we cannot effectively tackle climate change. Likewise, without urgent climate action, we risk deepening the very crises that drive conflict. So if we fail to preserve peace, we will fail to combat climate change.
I wanted to have this one because we are in a situation here in Europe where there is war very close in Ukraine and where there is genuine risk that it spreads, and where we've had the vital alliances that have kept the peace to some extent, for us at least, since the Second World War, are fragile and really under threat. At the very least, uncertainty, turbulence, doubt, fear. And in those circumstances, to not address war whilst talking about climate change would just be unrealistic. I happen to be very much in favour of increasing expenditure on defence, by the way. And I gave a speech at a European Union event, I think in October last year, specifically on dual-purpose investing, trying, in fact, to challenge some of the orthodoxies inside the ESG framework for investment that exclude investments in defence, not specifically to increase investment in defence, although that might happen, but to be smart about investment in innovation that could have a dual purpose. So, for example, I'm very much in favour of electrifying as much of the economy as possible in Europe, anywhere, but certainly in Europe. The systems required to generate, store, distribute, manage power are essentially digital. You're making electrons, moving electrons, managing electrons. And they're far, far more efficient. And they're a brilliant way of increasing security if you are insecure because you import Russian oil and gas. But the system you build has got to be cyber secure. Otherwise, you're really at risk. And we are attacked every day in cyberspace by Russia and others. So this is a present reality. You can't look away from it. It's uncomfortable. It produces an anxiety all of its own. Resource will be diverted. And it's fundamental to the human condition that you prioritize immediacy of risk. As an animal, we've got very good trained instincts, fight or flight instincts. We're just not very good at dealing with a very diffuse risk coming from all directions over a long period of time. Climate change is really difficult to fit into our instinctive risk frameworks are very basic animal risk frameworks. War goes right to the top. I would argue that in our very comfortable liberal democracies, it is actually quite hard to properly communicate the level of risk. I work with an organization in Sweden called Worthwhile Capital. And I remember going to a dinner there last year where we had big institutional investors around the table and a speech from Nicholas, one of the partners, who was explaining, partly because of his background in military security, in military intelligence, how ill-prepared Sweden was for the risk that was actually present then, higher now. And not so long after that, I saw the Swedish government announcing to the Swedish population, we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared for war with Russia. And our society is comfortable and a bit complacent. And compare Finland with its long, long border of Russia, where they're much, much more prepared. I imagine all the Baltic states are now rapidly increasing their preparedness, even though they are small. And Poland is now investing 5% of its GDP in defense. Yeah, and it's a big country. It's a country doing well, but very, very aware of the pattern of the history, the amount of times Russia has invaded a neighbor over the last 50 years.
And we do spend so much money on defense. It's interesting you saying that you're a supporter of an increase in defense spending, because I tried to look it up, and NATO members alone is $1,195 billion. And then worldwide, it's $2,240 billion. And the USA accounts for 39% of total global spending. So in the US in particular, such a high amount is spent on defense already.
I think it's one of the hardest conversations to have with yourself, let alone with others, because those numbers are shockingly large, aren't they? And yet I do hold the view that if you want to be free and independent, and if you want to have the kind of autonomy that's necessary to conduct an existence free of the controls of others, you have to defend yourself. And it necessarily escalates. So more money spent by one means more money spent by the other. And we have, Lord knows, so many nuclear weapons.
I was going to say, as soon as we get into nuclear weapons, it's enormous.
I can remember at Cambridge when I was studying international law, the course was split between the laws of war and the laws of peace. And it used to aggravate me. I used to get into all sorts of fights with, I remember with Professor Chris Greenwood, who taught me about it. I just found it was absurd that there'd be separate domains. And it just bothered me that there was such easy acceptance that war was almost a natural event, inevitable.
Okay.
And that, and therefore, the laws of war were all about understanding that when wars exist, then these are the ways one conducts oneself. But then the legality of nuclear weapons fell into the space between. And I found the debate about the legality of nuclear weapons immensely frustrating, just because you had to accept their existence in the first place and the real difficulty of disarming and the huge risk of disarming in an uncoordinated way, put massive pressure on international law and international institutions and diplomacy, of course, to do that. But you couldn't even do that without an expression of real-world power. So you had this constant tension between escalation and a race to have more and more and more and more before you could even have a conversation about having less. Yeah, awful paradox. And I feel that very much now with climate, because, as you say, the numbers are shocking, the amount spent on defense, and yet right now I would be in favor of more. Funnily enough, one of the things that we're learning from Ukraine's resistance to Russia is how effective they have been with very little. The innovation that's come by being at a disadvantage in terms of weaponry. So Russia is in a full-scale war economy and has been for years. Their economy is in large part dedicated to war, much of their industrial production, and they're also careless about life. The sheer numbers of Russian dead are staggering, and they just don't seem to worry about those numbers. They still feel like the Russian empire is a strategic objective that Russian people are either prepared to support or feel like they have no option but to support. And the rest of us have to defend ourselves against that. That requires expenditure. Now, maybe we can, what the Ukrainians have done with their kind of, amateur drone production, which has become now professional drone production. I mean, there's a lot to be learned from that. But the one thing for sure is that warfare escalates technology innovation in order to be both better defended, but also to be able to better be the aggressor. And all of this, as you say, distracts from dealing with other issues like climate change. And just the tension between the immediacy of risk and the longer-term risk is almost impossible to resolve, which is why I think the dual-purpose investing approach might help figure out, again, how to build more resilient systems, how to be prosperous and free. I think there's quite a lot of overlap.
I remember talking a bit about this with my classmates during my master's, that I think it was in the context of ESG and how certain industries, can they ever be sustainable? And weapons did come up, and we were talking about, green guns and net zero military. Like, it all just seems like an oxymoron to me. Like, I don't know. I find it really hard to sink in the idea of how do we make our military more sustainable. It just seems very strange.
It's easier
to me.
The other way around, isn't it? How do we learn from military technology to make the rest of our economy more sustainable? Because there might be some breakthrough in material science, so something that's lighter, and something that has a benefit to the use of a weapon or an aircraft or a missile that could be applied in a peaceful context. Lots of examples of that. But here we are in a very, very dangerous time where there could well be mobilization of young people to fight, 18 to 26, and then if you look at what's happened in Ukraine, it just gets widened. That's why there are so many men and women in their 30s, 40s more fighting, just because they have to. But I would say Poland and the Baltic states and Finland already, Sweden, they'll all be thinking about it. And there'll be a generation of younger folk who will certainly not welcome that prospect, but will find that there is a real tension between their values and their desire to fix problems that they are really concerned with, and preparedness and resistance to real hot war, armed conflict.
Yeah, it's really scary, and I do agree with you that you're probably not going to be too worried about long-term climate temperature rising if you've got a war on your doorstep. But at the same time, moves like decreasing our aid budget, I think it's a lack of sort of systemic thinking in that by reducing our aid budget, some of that will be going towards conflict resolution and prevention in other countries. So in terms of the long-term thinking around conflict,
Yeah.
maybe it's short-sighted.
Yes. It's also a very small budget by comparison.
True.
There were other parts of the public expenditure, many, many more noughts on that could have been looked at. And unfortunately, what is described as the aid budget, which has always been a combination of aid and foreign policy, aid and security policy, always, sometimes criticized for that reason, that it wasn't sufficiently purely in the interests of those who were impoverished in country X or Y, but it was actually tied to some other motive. But it always was. And peace and security is part of it. The same with diplomacy. So easy to ridicule. Why are all these diplomats taking all their time to talk? 'Twas ever thus, and it's all about keeping the peace. And when it breaks down, it hurts. I think the point you make about losing trust and finding it hard to build necessary collaborative arrangements is really true and very obvious right now. Equally, sometimes under huge pressure of conflict, it pulls people together, right? Yeah. And that's just as possible.
I've seen a few articles about this idea of environmental peace building as well. So the idea that climate change can be a crisis multiplier, but actually environmental degradation and loss of resources can be a reason for local communities to come together to protect the environment in some way. So maybe that's something that should be prioritized.
I don't know whether you saw there was a piece that was interpreted in all the kind of ways you might expect in the various different media outlets about the generation behind yours, I should say, and their willingness to fight for their country. And quite low numbers, very low numbers. I think I remember 11% or something like that.
Wow.
So that they would. And that causes alarm, and there's always people of an older generation who think that the younger generation should sacrifice their lives. Anyway, much more nuance and much more interpretation and much more understanding is required to properly understand those numbers and motivations. But my interpretation of them is that the whole subject area induces fear and anxiety, and there's been very little preparation for it in the lives of those who are in that 16 to 26 bracket, if you widen it a little bit. One shouldn't be all that surprised of that reaction. But what I hope it's possible to do by really paying attention to the connection between climate change and war, the possibility of finding an alignment between peace and security, energy security and climate security, is it concentrates the minds of decision makers in government, yes, but also in society at large, in what a resilient system looks like, particularly in power, but also in transport and also the supply chain issues we've talked about before. Where do we get our resources from? What are our vulnerabilities? And it perhaps improves the solidarity that you have in a culture, in a nation, because of the threat. It sounds glib, and I kind of mean it to be slightly lighter, but you're unlikely to get attention on climate change when Putin's in charge of the UK, all right? That's not going to be his priority issue. And we also know that when that regime is particularly vulnerable to fluctuations in the oil price, And we know that many of the sanctions that we have put in place have not been adequately implemented. A lot of workarounds, particularly actually with oil and gas transport. It's a pretty shocking avoidance of sanctions and complicity all over the world. New route structures, different marked tankers, refining in India and then being exported as Indian, all sorts of ways of avoiding the rigors of the sanctions imposed against it. But nonetheless, a war economy like Russia's is also a fossil economy and absolutely dependent upon sales. If you reduce demand, you reduce their power to invest.
Well, there was quite a lot of blame towards the energy transition and renewable energies around the time the war started, because people were saying, our reliance on Russian gas is why Putin was able to make a move. But so, there's also that link as well.
Yeah, we do need, when gas prices spike, just because of the way we designed our system, it needs redesigning, but when the gas prices spike, that's the reference price for power prices in the UK. And bills go up, and people don't like it. And they don't seem to be able to accept the straightforward facts that is the case. It's been quite easy for an argument to be made, however false, that it's the consequence of renewables. It's sometimes quite hard to know how else you repeat the analysis over and over again and get a different result. But it is gas prices that drive the price of household bills up, and gas prices go up when there is conflict, and the supply chains for imported gas, which is most of our gas, of course, are affected by conflict. And not just the obvious Russian gas, but gas from other parts of the world too. So, I don't know, I feel very much as if we've got to grapple with the interconnection between two and resist the temptation to put the climate change issue aside, as you were saying, right? Because there have been ebbs and flows in this climate change debate all of my working life. It's nearly 40 years now. There have been loads of moments where the what about has been related to a conflict. Well, now there is conflict here, or now there is war there, or now there's a priority. And it is all about the assertion that something more important is in front of us right now that we must deal with, and we'll put climate change to one side. And that's happened over decades. And it's not a good option. And it requires very skillful government and a well-informed public that can understand that you've got to do both.
Yeah, it feels like there's always money for war. And you have every year, you have the COP conferences, and money, countries commit such small amounts to the loss and damage fund, for example. But then a few weeks later, all this money appears
Suddenly, it's so true, Daisy. And you have an immense public battle, harsh words exchanged over the extraordinary amount of money that is going into climate change, and then nothing. It's tiny by comparison. Tiny.
Yeah. It feels to me like we've got our priorities wrong somewhere, but maybe that's naive of me to wish for a world with no war and no one needs nuclear weapons. We should all be friends.
It's just a moment when music comes into my head, or what is it good for?
Absolutely nothing.
Yeah. But equally, I have, that brilliant black and white film with Orson Welles, The Third Man. Great film.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, that's a way back. Anyway, with Orson Welles says, look at Switzerland. Hundreds of years of peace, and all they produced was a cuckoo clock. There is definitely something essential to the human condition in conflict, war and peace, conflict and creativity. constraint and innovation, which is why I'm really keen on this sort of dual purpose. It may seem small, but it really isn't. In times of conflict, people under pressure reinvent systems. They do things that they have to do in order to defend themselves. Things get reorganized really fast. Whole new ways of production, new materials. That is our history. And so much innovation goes into killing people that it produces this sort of awful paradox. All the breakthroughs in science and technology that are associated with causing harm to someone else, to another. But the plain fact is, we're in a dangerous time. We've got to defend ourselves. We just have to. And I'd love to see that done in a smart way, where we pay attention to the benefits of increasing our resilience in every possible way, and to try and make sure as much of what we do to protect ourselves from harm actually protects ourselves from harm of another kind.
So many of the countries, though, outside of the wars that we're hearing about on the news every day, there are conflicts going on. And I've read that of the 15 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 13 are struggling with violent conflicts. And so there is this issue of countries that maybe don't have the same resources and capacity to innovate. I don't know, maybe that's not true, but yeah, there's a lot of conflict going on outside of Russia and Ukraine, for example.
And that's where you see the diversion of resources in its most stark form, don't you? Money for weapons, but not for...
Yeah.
And that vulnerability issue, the sort of lack of resilience, often lack of adequate institutions to provide protection to citizens, those places of conflict are obviously more vulnerable. And I'm sure what is meant by that statistic is not just from the physical consequences, but the inability to cope with all of the other consequences. Inability to reshape a society that is able to flourish in times of where climate change is an amplifier of risk, especially with drought and flood, but increasingly days of extreme heat, where it's hard to have high productivity, for economic growth purposes. Lots of countries in that list would have all of those factors.
Definitely.
And if they're funding conflict, internal with a neighboring state, those are resources that are not going into solving these other adaptation and resilience matters. And that's a nasty cycle that's heading down.
And then I touched on it a bit in the introduction, but the environmental impacts of war as well, and the way it contributes to, environmental problems more broadly than climate change. But it's a huge contributor in terms of emissions.
Those numbers are, I hadn't heard them before.
And rebuilding after a conflict as well.
Yeah.
Like
shattered cities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge amounts of resources and the associated emissions needed to rebuild cities.
Yeah. Agricultural land that is mined and impossible to use. It's it's a shocker. I mean, I can't provide. I mean, there's sort of platitudes that come to mind that are quickly discarded because they're just inadequate. But it is a routine and regular, sadly, whataboutism issue. Can't focus on climate now. Obviously can't deal with climate now because. And I both understand and reject that you can't do both. And I'd love to see extra effort being made not to trade off one against the other, and to assert that more value can be created for a society that's under threat if these twin imperatives are seen as being connected. Even if there are really short-term trade-offs that are just, if we haven't got, if we're under threat within the next 5 years or so, just put a time frame on it, here in the UK, we aren't going to have hydrogen aircraft fighting, in the airspace above us, are we? Right? But under pressure in that period of time, I bet we have more hybrid hydrogen and electric aircraft in operation. So I just think that
at what cost?
well, I mean, we struggle with aviation. Where's the answer? We sort of rather vaguely finished up with less, right? Better, a little bit, and we noted that hydrogen and electric aircraft were going through their tests and getting bigger, and there were potential there, but we didn't see it as offering a near-term solution for the vast majority of aviation. But who knows? If there are scarce resources and real conflict on your doorstep, you might innovate faster.
Silver lining.
Thin one.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you actually, James, because I was reading that under the UNFCCC, military emissions reporting is voluntary, and that partly came from the US at Kyoto in 97?
I don't remember,
Do you remember that?
No, I don't. I do remember a huge amount of activity as that deal came close to being agreed, that was sort of excluding this, that, and the other.
Yeah, the US asked for military exemptions.
Really complicated discussions, many of which I struggled with in the corridors, especially when, in the end, the battle was over numbers that were just crude, trades, 5 versus 7 versus. They were all nowhere near the kind of reality of what was necessary, but they were something. But I don't remember that one. And it's interesting that obviously the emissions are huge. Look at what armies and navies and air forces run on. That's before you get to all the explosive material. And as you say, the destruction. I mean, look at the, and that's why ecocide remains relevant, and maybe more so now. Look at the environmental harm caused by Russia in Ukraine, and frankly in Syria and Chechnya and these other places. Their military tactics are utterly destructive. I mean, you might say, well, of course they are, but no, pause to think about how Russia conducts its offenses. It absolutely destroys everything, particularly in urban environments, and tries to degrade infrastructure, but also crush opposition in the territory they're going after. Massive release of massive carbon consequence, and obviously, if you really don't care about climate change, you don't care about that particular consequence. Destroying a city is bad enough without having an extra concern about the climate. But it doesn't mean to say it's not there. It is, and the sort of waging of war that Putin has been doing absolutely crosses all of those lines that one day, hopefully, there will be an accounting of. There'll be a price paid. So let's be clear. We are not, we here in the UK, we are not in a hot war with Russia today. We're awfully close. If you listen to some of the Russian propagandists, you'd think we were. Certainly there's lots of threat and bombast, and there's no doubt that we are engaged with Russia in a conflict, and not just because of Ukraine. So there are Russia's testing our airspace, our the waters around the UK all the time. Right? There's obviously high levels of tension there, but we're not there. And one way to look at this climate change and this peace, energy, and climate security nexus that is more constructive is that the more we do to make us resilient in our power system, say, the better able we'll be to cope any conflict that does become hot with Russia, if only because we free up other resources. Because it's a relatively easy assumption that you need to be energy secure in order to be secure, right? And we have a relatively modest-sized army these days, and we have much smaller forces than Russia, but we also have the capacity to build alliances, and there's much of what is happening at the moment shows how necessary it is for us to be connected with our neighbors and to pool resources, and our resources are considerable. We have more wealth, we have greater technological capacity. We just haven't geared our economies to fighting, a war of the scale that Russia is currently engaged in. But we could. And I would hope that before we get there, we've done everything we possibly can to deal with the climate change issue in a way that's consistent with being well defended.
Thank you so much for listening to Fossil versus Future. Please subscribe to our podcast and give us a rating. And please follow us on social media. Let us know the questions that you want answers to or that you'd like us to discuss.